Hello, my name is Roisin and welcome back to my channel. So today I thought I would do some personalised book recommendations. So I mentioned it on the community tab and also over on my Instagram, which you should follow if you aren't already. If you want to ask personalised book recommendations, that's the place where I will ask you, and which is linked in the description as always. So I got a few requests here, and some of these requests I've given more than one answer to, because when can I ever be succinct? So I think we should jump straight in. The first request was for something light and sweet, and for that I would suggest Love in Colour by Bolu Babalola. This is a collection of short stories that are retellings of mythology, where people fall in love. They are love stories. And the majority of them I think are West African myths, but there's also Chinese myth, Greek myth, Egyptian myths, so they are from all over the place, and they are all quite sweet love stories. Some of them have a slightly darker part to them, but it's not in relation to the love story itself, if that makes sense, just a slightly darker premise. I thought that these were incredibly beautifully written. I think that Babalola really does have a way with words. It's not my favourite short story collection ever, but that was partially because the focus on love stories did become a little bit repetitive for me. But if you are looking for something light and sweet, I think they would be perfect. And also I feel like because it's short stories, it's something you could dip in and out of whenever you felt the need for just a light, sweet love story. I've got it all on my iPad here, but I don't have the names of everyone who requested, so I probably should have done that, but there we go. A book that gives crisp, early fall, new beginnings vibes. So this one, the only thing I can think of is books with an academic setting, because of course academics begin in September. And for this one I chose a book that I read earlier this year in a vlog where I was reading books that Storygraph recommended to me, which I will leave in the cards above. And this was a book that I didn't think I would like when I first read the synopsis. So if the synopsis sounds like something that wouldn't usually draw you in, but you usually like books that I like, I think that you would still like this one. This is called The Philosopher's Flight by Tom Miller, and it's set in an alternate America in the 1910s, where there are these people called sigillerists, which is basically witchcraft, but controlled by the scientific method rather than like just some fantasy that is unexplained. Most of the sigillerists are women, but there is this man who can do magic. His mother was a sigillerist, both his sisters are, and he ends up he wants to go to school to join the they are the rescuers basically during the First World War. They bring people to safety. But in this world, both the women who are sigillerists are really against male sigillerists and they give him a really hard time, but also the sigillerists are under attack from these men who think that women should stay in the kitchen and not use magic. So there's a lot of politics involved in it as well. Yeah, so it's quite hard to describe. I feel like I've not done a great job of describing the synopsis, but what I would say is that this book really builds the world that it's in, but it also has really great characters. Most of the characters are women and they are all really fleshed out, really different from one another, which I think can be difficult when you have such an ensemble cast, to make everyone very distinct. The writing itself is really of the time. It really feels like, I guess it feels a bit later, but like a screwball comedy kind of, the way that it's written, which I love that kind of classic film. And because it's, set in it's set in New England during a school term in a kind of old-fashioned Ivy League red brick kind of thing in this alternate world, and it's historical fiction and it's funny and light and really warm characters and interesting relationships. Yeah, I definitely think it gives all the New Beginnings warm autumnal vibes. So we've got beautiful writing, engaging, thoughtful but not too dark. Now the one that came to mind is a little dark, but it's dark in a whimsical way, so I think that the darkness works, and that is What Is Not Yours Is Not Yours by Helen Oyeyemi, the second short story collection that I'm recommending in this video. What Is Not Yours Is Not Yours are a collection of stories that are kind of interlinked. They are almost in the same world, but not quite, and they are also linked by the themes of keys and flowers. A lot of them are also fairy tale retellings. There is a very, very clever Pinocchio retelling. There's a Little Red Riding Hood retelling in here as well. It has some of the best writing that I've read. I really want to read some more of Helen Oyeyemi, some of her novels, because I haven't yet, but her writing really drew me in. It is beautiful, very clever, exactly like you requested. It is also kind of darkly whimsical, which is something that I always enjoy in books. I think that as well as having a darkness to these books there is also a warmth. There are a lot of good family relationships and, again, love stories, but they are a little twisted from what you would expect. I think that she really manages to build up a world so well, despite the fact it being a short story, and also her characters are very well fleshed out, and there is always some sort of mystery or darkness that will keep you drawn on into the story. The reason that I chose this one is because a lot of the books that I read that have beautiful writing are really dark, but I think that the whimsy aspect of this helps to make the darkness not feel too threatening or scary or anything. I wouldn't say these are scary at all, or traumatic in any way. They are dark as fairy tales are dark, rather than dark as traumatic books about war are dark. The next one was really, really tricky for me, and that was a book set in ancient Egypt. I don't think I've ever read a book set in like Pharaoh times ancient Egypt. I don't even know if I've ever heard of any books that are like highly recommended that are set in ancient Egypt. But I do have 2 recommendations for you that are around the theme of ancient Egypt. So the first one is The Salt Roads by Nalo Hopkinson. This is actually told from 3 different women from different time periods. So we have a woman in Haiti during the slave rebellions of the 18th century. We have a woman in France who is Charles Baudelaire's lover in the 19th century. But the third perspective is the one that I think works for this theme, and it is of an enslaved woman in Alexandria in the 4th century CE. So whilst it isn't ancient Egypt, it is the Egypt of ancient Rome. So it is kind of an ancient civilization in Egypt, but it's not like Nefertiti, Tutankhamun. It is post-pharaohs. It's when Egypt is a vassal of the Roman Empire. But I think it still has the ancient vibes. It's still dealing with slavery, but it is a Christian, it's kind of a Christian meets pagan 4th century bit, and a 4th century Egypt. So it might not be quite what you are looking for, but I think that Hopkinson does a really great job of building this time period, of fleshing out characters. There are lots of things that, like them going to the baths and worshipping certain goddesses and things that I think are really evocative of the time period in which it is set. This is the smallest of the perspectives though, but I think that the rest of the book, it is dark, but it is beautifully written. It weaves in a lot of West African and Haitian religion and folklore, and it talks about race and gender and enslavement. There's really a lot to sink your teeth into. In fact, I read it in the same vlog that I read The Philosopher's Flight, so if you want to find out more, you can go and watch that vlog. But it's very sad, very dark, very melancholy, but it does have a touch of the Egypt of the ancient world, so hopefully that will draw you in. So the next person asked for something that they won't be able to put down, and for this I thought The Pull of the Stars by Emma Donoghue. This is set in 1918 during the flu epidemic in Dublin on a maternity ward where women who have the flu are sent. We follow a nurse, a female doctor and a skivvy, a young woman called Birdie who has never worked in the hospital but who has volunteered herself to help out. And I think the reason that I think that this one is impossible to put down is that the characters are really well developed. You really feel for them. You really empathise with particularly Nurse Powers and Birdie. You really are drawn to them as characters and their relationship that they build. I also think because it is set only over the course of 3 days, just 3 days during the pandemic, there is a lot of action and a lot to draw you on, and it is very, very fast paced, but it also has a space for beautiful writing and character development. Of course, there are a lot of like medical dramatic things that go on, a lot of like trigger warnings if you're not interested in reading very graphic descriptions of difficult births, and there is also a lot of politics involved in it, the treatment of women in Ireland in the 20th century, particularly pregnant women, and also unmarried women and the children of unmarried women. So I think that it is saying some really powerful things, but doing so in a way that is really pulls you on. Things happen so fast and you almost feel like the pages are turning for you, because everything is just, you're so towards the end kind of scared and also drawn towards what's going to happen, because obviously it's during a severe pandemic when there is no treatment. So if you don't want to read about that right now, fair enough, but I think that makes it really, really compelling. Next, someone asked me for something that focuses on a person from the tourism industry working at a B&B or a flight attendant, which this one I had a really difficult time with. I don't think that I have ever read anything set around a B&B or about a flight attendant. To me, both of those premises sound like they're either going to be romance or thriller, which are two things that I don't really read a lot of. But because I started to think, oh, that sounds like romance, there is one romance series that I have read that is kind of this vibe, and that is the Spindle Cove series by Tessa. These are set at a seaside resort in England in the early 19th century, about a woman who has set up this resort for other young women who are disgraced or friendless or just misfits in society, and it is nicknamed by everyone around Spinster's Cove. The first one is set around the woman who set up this cove for young women. So she's kind of in charge of their activities and in charge of what goes on. There is a kind of tea room, so that's kind of B&B vibes. And of course, the militia men suddenly arrive in this town, and all of these women's lives are thrown into chaos as we see how these manly militiamen who've only ever been around men and these spinster women on the cove, how they interact. So I think it kind of has tourism vibes. It definitely has very early British tourism, seaside resort kind of vibes. So I think that kind of counts. I hope that's what you were looking for. I did find this prompt quite tricky. The next prompt is historical fiction set before the 1700s. And I know what you think I'm going to say, because I very nearly always say the exact same thing. And I can't not say Wolf Hall. I would 100% recommend Wolf Hall to absolutely everyone who has not read it yet. But the other one that I'm going to recommend is Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell. So this is also set in the Tudor period, although a bit later than Wolf Hall, and may even be set in the Stuart period actually. So that Elizabeth James I crossover time period, and is about Agnes, or Anne Hathaway, who was married to Shakespeare. Shakespeare is never mentioned by name in the book. He's called Will, he's called a playwright, he's called various other things, but he's never really known as William Shakespeare, and that's because it's not about Shakespeare the myth, it is about the real life family. So the first half of the book kind of leads up to the death of Hamnet, Shakespeare's only son, and then afterwards we kind of see the ramifications of this grief. And I think it's a really great period. It's a really great portrait of a woman in that time period who was middle class, who was not, like, a lot of stuff written about that time period is about royalty, because of course most of our sources are about royalty, but this is much more about a woman living in a town, the town of Stratford, in the late 16th, early 17th century, and about like trade and about what was actually going on in the lived experiences of women. Now, it does fall into the historical fiction trope of witchy woman with some sort of power, which I know a lot of people don't enjoy, so if you don't enjoy that, I would avoid this. But I think it does a great part of showing what a child's life would be like, and of what a woman's life would be like that is not either she's royalty or tainted by like witchcraft, even though she does have powers, but there's no like witch trials, and because I feel like those things are really represented well in history, in historical fiction. It is also really moving, very sad. It does a lot of playing with Shakespeare. So if you know Shakespeare, twins trading places, that sort of thing. Also the idea of nutshells in a nutshell, which is a quote from Hamlet, comes up, and the idea of a very small life, Hamnet being only 11, a very small life, and it kind of plays with the idea of Shakespeare's fame and what it is to live a mundane life, or to the importance of fame. So there's a lot in it, and I definitely think it's worth a read if you are looking for pre-1700s historical fiction. The next request was for something dark but also deep. Now, this person mentioned 2 thrillers. I cannot remember what thrillers they were right now, so I think that by dark that's kind of the kind of thing they're looking for. And so for this, I'm going to recommend In the Woods by Tana French. This is the first in the Dublin Murder Squad series, and it is about a man who is on the Dublin Murder Squad who's been called in to investigate the murder of this young girl, but the place that he's going to is the place that he actually grew up, where he was part of the disappearance of 2 children. So 3 children disappeared and he was the only one to come back. and there are very mysterious circumstances surrounding this. It's an unsolved case, and so nobody he works with knows that he was involved in this first case, but he's going back to the town that he grew up in for another case that has happened. So of course we're talking about the murder of a young girl, we're talking about that sort of police procedural. In the beginning we are told two things about this man, that he values the truth very highly and that he lies. So there is the idea of an unreliable narrator, and also his having the trauma from the past going back. So we see a lot of darkness, a lot of spiralling from that. But I think that as well as it being dark in that way, it is incredibly beautifully written, and it really makes you think and explore ideas of like psychology, and the way the characters are described, their relationships is really well done. They're all really fleshed out, and you can really feel and believe in their relationships with one another. There is also comedy from that, but it does get very, very dark towards the end, as you would expect when you're wrapping up a thriller. There's a lot of depth to all of the characters, from suspects to the police, and it is, I find, quite interesting to see it from a police procedural perspective, because all of the options are kind of laid out before you, because they're talking about what they suspect and they're talking to one another. So you are given all of the options as to what has happened, rather than things coming out totally out of left field at the end of the book, which I think can always feel a bit Deus Ex Machina. I think it's very well done and very cleverly woven, and definitely something that I think would work if you're looking for that dark but literary thriller. The next is something that wraps me in the world, something captivating that wraps me in the world but is not too effortful. And I think that this just sounds like middle grade to me. If you want something that truly like captures your heart and where the world feels really like fantastical and wonderful and well realised, but it's not a difficult read, that sounds like middle grade to me, and I'm going to recommend The Girl Who Circumnavigated Fairyland in a Ship of Her Own Making. This is another book that is incredibly beautifully written, and if you like folklore, fairy tales, that sort of thing, it plays with those sorts of tropes. So I think that it is captivating for that sort of audience. It is about September, a girl who is kind of melancholy in her life and becomes ravished or taken by the fairies to Fairyland. She's taken by the west wind and she ends up in Fairyland, off on an adventure where she can choose which way to go, and eventually she discovers that Fairyland is under the thumb of a dictator and she must find a way to overthrow the dictator and free Fairyland. It's an incredibly witty and verbose kind of book. There's a lot of beautiful language where the building of the world and the beauty of the language are kind of entwined together. It is a book with a lot of charm. A lot of the characters have, like for example, September meets a wyvery who is half wyvern, half library, and there are witches and velocipedes, which are like stallion bicycles. So yeah, there's a lot of whimsy and wonder in the world, but at the same time a lot of heart, and I think it is exactly the sort of thing that I would want to read for something cozy and captivating with a beautiful world. Next was a comforting, easy read, and I think there are lots of comforting, easy reads. It depends what kind of finds comfort for you. One that fulfills this prompt for me, and so hopefully will for you, is Chocolat by Joanne Harris. I read this first years and years ago. I was an actual child, and I think I've reread it every few years since. So I don't know how much of my love for it is bound up in nostalgia, but I definitely think it works as a comfort read. It is about a mother and daughter who are travellers, and they wind up in this small town. It's set in the 1950s, I think, or 40s or 50s. It's definitely after the Second World War. They end up in this town setting up a chocolate shop during Lent. And the mayor of the town is very religious, and he is very upset by them setting up a temptation during Lent, and it is just about their integration into this town. It's about how the town treats travellers and immigrants and outsiders, and also the relationships that these outsiders build with some of the other outsiders of the town. So not people who have, so there are other travellers who turn up and people who are not liked by the town, and their relationship with so it's about small town vibe. It's got those small town vibes, but kind of in a sinister kind of way, although not super sinister. Like it's not super dark. There are dark moments, but it's really about the warmth of the chocolate shop and of the woman who runs it and her daughter, and they're like inviting everyone in. Also, you have to have chocolate while you read it, because there are such incredibly beautiful descriptions of chocolate that you will be hard pressed not to have a craving after you've read this book. It's just a lovely warm hug. There is some sadness in it, but it's kind of a Sunday afternoon film sadness rather than anything too harrowing. Someone requested magical realism, and I mean, that's a very broad request. It's a whole genre. Although I know there are some arguments about what can be considered magical realism, because magical realism is very much a genre founded in and rooted in Latin America and Latin American culture. And so there is an argument that things that are not set or from Latin American writers cannot be called magical realism, and so should be called fabulism instead. Sing Unburied Sing by Jessamine Ward. So if you were looking for some really moving, difficult magical realism, I would recommend Sing Unburied Sing. It is about Jojo and his mother Leonie, and they are travelling with Leonie's daughter and her friend to collect Jojo's father, who is about to be released from prison. And it is basically set around this road trip, although we begin in the house where Leonie and Jojo live with Leonie's parents, her mother who is dying of cancer, and her father Rivers. And as we travel through up into this prison, we see other parts of their history. We see what happened to Leonie's brother, and flashback to all of these people's relationships with one another, as well as Rivers' past himself, who was in that same prison of about 40 years before. When we get to the prison, there is also the magical realism element, is that this prison is haunted by the ghosts of its past. It's so beautifully written, incredibly beautifully written. The parts that are told from Leonie's perspective feel almost like a prose poem. It talks about her addiction as well, and it talks about her addiction, and it also talks about police brutality and violence, and how the carceral system is a hangover, a legacy from slavery, because Rivers, when he was there in the 1960s, I think, was literally picking cotton. And it is a very melancholy book, a very sad book, where we explore the wounds of the past and the ways that they have repercussions into the future, structural wounds and also individual wounds, and how they affect a family. The relationships in this, again, are really beautifully built. The relationship between Jojo and his little sister, and his tenderness, taking care of her, really will make you cry, especially when you remember that he's just a child himself. The way that Ward deals with, the way Ward does perspective, shifting perspective so that we see a full picture of people. We see the way that Jojo really looks up to his grandfather Rivers, but his more fraught relationship with his daughter Leonie, and we also see the way Jojo perceives his mother, and the way that his mother is trying, when we see things from her own perspective, but her own failings. It's a really brilliant character study and some of the best writing I've read all year. And then finally, the final request is for historical fiction with a female protagonist that's not set in World War II. And hello, welcome to my channel. I read historical fiction with female protagonists that aren't set during World War II. So if you are interested in my favourite historical fiction, I'll leave 2 videos in the cards above where I talk about some of that. Ones that I wanted to mention, we have The Salt Roads by Nalo Hopkinson, which I've already mentioned. The Old Drift by Namwali Serpel, which is one of the other best books that I've read so far this year, which is historical fiction set in Zambia from 1904 and then up into the future. So it's historical fiction, political fiction, Afrofuturism and science fiction, with various different, told from many different perspectives, but the majority of them are women. And we again deal with the repercussions of history and individual choice, and how that intersects with structural things, colonialism, post-colonialism and neo-colonialism. There's a lot going on in this book. It's one that I've talked about a lot before, but it is really witty and funny. If you love Zadie Smith, I feel like you will love Namwali Serpel. It has that same vibe, the same politics, but being told from the perspective of real people having conversations about politics. It has like bizarre, weird satire elements of it, like a man who's trying to be like fight for the freedom of Zambia by starting a space race in which he only rolls people down the hill in barrels. It's really funny. Really well written. It's kind of got a tinge of magical realism as well. There's a woman who her hair just grows from all of her body, and it shows she looks like Cousin It, and it's just such a rich book. There's so much in it. I read it when I was reading books from Southern Africa. If I still have space up there, I'll put it up there. But it is one of those books that I think really would bear rereading, so if you haven't read it yet, you need to, because you're going to have to get back to reading it again a second time. Other ones, The Crimson Petal and the White, which is about Sugar, who is a sex worker in Victorian England. It's kind of a Dickensian book, if Dickens would write the really dark stuff. It is again, really incredibly beautifully written, really feels rich and really builds the world. The Wonder by Emma Donoghue, that's another one that's told from a woman's perspective. I mentioned The Salt Roads earlier by Nalo Hopkinson. Yeah, I talk about historical fiction from a woman with female protagonists all of the time, so if that's what you're after, I really think you should subscribe. So those are all of the recommendations I think I can fit into this video. So thank you for those of you who requested them, and thank you for watching this video. If you did enjoy it, I put out new video. If you did enjoy it, please remember to like it, and I put out new videos every Thursday and Sunday, so remember to subscribe as well. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.